and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. Listeners, it's almost impossible for me to believe that the last time I interviewed this next guest author, we were in the dark COVID trenches of late 2020, a time which also followed a period when Australia had experienced devastating bushfires. Back then, my guest and I were chatting about a beautiful book called The Fire Wombat, a brilliant and beautiful story inspired by a wombat who survived one of these bushfires. I am, of course, talking about one of Australia's best-loved, best-selling authors, Jackie French, who this year has yet a new novel out. Called The Whisperer's War, published by HQ Fiction, it's an incredible wartime story set in England between 1938 and 1947. A story that examines, amongst many other things, the cost of war and the quest for wealth, power and status that drive it. A unique and entirely gripping account of the war and one woman's fight to save her country from falling into Nazi hands. I absolutely loved this story. And Jackie is here with me today to talk about this fascinating book. Welcome back to the podcast, Jackie.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me.
I can remember so vividly that day when we last spoke and you had to drive down the hill from your home to get better internet reception, only to find that a giant funnel web spider had accompanied you.
I do remember that. A now deceased funnel web spider.
Indeed. I don't think I'd ever seen anyone so calmly halt an interview. It was just like, hang on a minute. I've just seen a funnel web spider in the car with me.
I was not calm. This was definitely an act.
Most certainly outwardly calm in any event. In the intervening years, you've written another 4 books at least. There's probably more since The Fire Wombat. You know, when we last chatted, I was talking to you about your historical novels because you have written quite a number of them. And I specifically remember asking you back then how you decided what to write. And I think your answer was something along the lines of wanting to write about hidden histories and uncovering things that we've forgotten or things written out of history, like women and Indigenous people. Would you say that these were things that were uppermost in your mind when you started writing The Whisperer's War?
Exactly. There were 2 reasons for writing it. The first one was that for the first time in my life, I have actually turned one of my daydreams into a book. Every night, ever since I think I was about 4, I would tell myself this lovely, happy story to get myself off to sleep, and I still do it. One of them, for many, many years, was set in World War II, with 3 refugee children who had been treated absolutely appallingly, finding refuge in the most perfect place, this wonderful old house with intriguing cellars and a trout thing, and the cellars are full of goods to see them through the war. And as the book and the daydream develop, life gets better and better and richer for these children. And there are all sorts of wonderful things. Mrs. Strips, who was on the variety stage, teaching them to can and things like that. So I wanted to put that in because it's good to know that in a time of war, in a time of bushfire, in a time of hardship, it is still possible to have incredible happiness and joy and giggles. So, yes. That part of the book should make you feel happy, comfortable, but the other half isn't. I always get very, very grumbly whenever I see an article or yet again a documentary or a telemovie about how the Duke of Windsor abdicated to be with the woman he loved. It's complete and utter balderdash. He was kicked off the throne. He was tricked into abdicating because he would never do it voluntarily. He signed this enormous lot of papers without reading them. His mother was there, his brother was there. He thought he was abdicating to be reinstated as king regent, that his brother would also abdicate, leaving him as the regent for his niece, Elizabeth, and she was just a little girl. He assumed he would be king regent for life. He knew he would never have children. He was unable to have children, so it didn't matter that she would inherit it, but he would then be free to marry Mrs. Simpson because he was no longer in line an heir to the throne. He did not read the papers. The papers also included that he was not to be in England without the express permission of the king or queen. And it also, he signed away all of his property and his income as well. Next morning, he was absolutely furious when he found out what had happened, that his brother had not abdicated. He was being hailed as king. Everyone was excited. And he wrote this incredible denunciation, calling on the people of Britain to stand up and rebel for their true king, etc. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, realised that this would be a bit of a problem. And in one of his autobiographies, he explained how it took him a couple of hours to explain to this not very bright man that he would look an absolute twit if he admitted that he'd abdicated by mistake. And instead of calling for that, Baldwin wrote that wonderful phrase, "to be with the woman I loved." But no, the Duke of Windsor did not give up all hopes of being king. But he was actually rather timid. He almost did it when they were in Portugal, but then he ran for the Spanish border instead of doing it. But when he was exiled as governor, he hated it. He hated black faces. One of his letters talks about being surrounded by the ugliest people on earth. He wrote a series of letters to Hitler. They corresponded ever since not since the abdication. One of the reasons for the abdication was because he was in constant communication with Hitler. They had hatched a plan that a Swedish friend would take him just on a jaunt on his schooner, on his yacht. They would meet a German submarine. The German submarine would then take him to England. He had been the one to suggest the Blitz to Hitler. He then wrote another letter asking that they make the Blitz even worse in the days before he was to come to England. He would come ashore at a secret spot. He would be taken to a supporter's house. The BBC had been invited to do an interview about something entirely different, but instead they would find the ex-king. And so no one could stop it going to air in a live broadcast. And he would promise that if I am king tonight, there will be a treaty with Hitler. If I am king tonight, no more bombs will fall on England. If I am king tonight, rationing will end because the blockade of England will stop. He almost made it. And in this book, it's about trying to find a suitable place for him to come ashore. It didn't happen. American intelligence sniffed out the plot. The Swedish yacht was never seen again, but neither were a lot of the letters for Hitler. I had known that there'd been a commando troop sent ahead of the main forces to capture all of the Duke's correspondence with Hitler. But unfortunately for them, they were only able to capture part of it. And in their escape, some of those letters were lost and found again later. There were also other ones that fell into the hands of the Russians. But as well, the Duke of Windsor, who, as I said, was not very bright, also gave interviews to two American magazines about it. That was hushed up, but they still appeared in the magazines. Look, I have to say, he did horrendous things, but I do feel sorry for him. He was married to a woman who, in fact, hadn't really wanted to marry him unless he was going to be king. She wanted the money. She wanted the influence. She was a fascist. She wanted to help make Britain have a treaty with Hitler all along. But she didn't particularly like the man who became her husband. And he loved her desperately. If he had only been born, someone to become a butcher or a baker or anything, or a scoutmaster, he probably would have been a staunch member of the community, leading the local scout group, doing lovely things and having a very, very happy small life. And instead, he was born into a role he was completely unable to understand, and other people took advantage of him. So, yes, we have got two plots. Actually, there's a third one, and that is also the love story. Lady Diana is asked to be a spy, not in Europe, but we tend to forget how many people in the 1930s were fascists, including, in fact, my great-grandfather. Most of them were actually extremely nice people, and they were not drawn to the extremes of fascism. But at the beginning of World War II, quite a lot of very influential people, including people in government, were fascists. Now, that did not mean that they were supporters of Hitler, but it was important to find out how many were part of this plot to put the ex-king back on the throne. And her job is to go to elegant dinner parties, etc., as a charming woman, pretend she is a sympathizer, and find out what the true political feelings are of her hosts. But she is told not to have anything more to do with an Australian airman at an aerodrome which has been quickly built. And that's one of the other myths when you see things like Foyle's War, that those daring young pilots who saved Britain in the Blitz were British. They weren't. Britain simply didn't have the number of experienced pilots. Nearly all of them were colonials. South Africa, a lot from Canada, a lot from Australia, including my ex-father-in-law. In fact, it was said that on many aerodromes, the only English accent you would ever hear would be the tea lady. So yes, that's one of the other ones. But she is told by British intelligence, who will not give her a reason, stop association with this man. And this man has, look, he's already fought the war in Denmark. He's survived Dunkirk. He is an extraordinary trainer. She believes him to be a man of absolutely unimpeachable integrity and incredible ability. But he is then transferred to fly what they called the Mosquitoes. They'd realized that most of the bombing raids in Europe were missing their targets. In fact, at one stage, I think there were 12 in a row that had completely missed their targets. So the Mosquitoes were tiny little craft, very light. They were made of plywood. They were crewed by one or two men. They couldn't even take weapons with them because they would be too heavy. And these tiny little craft just went from cloud to cloud to cloud incredibly quickly, led the crews to the target, and then escaped. And their life expectancy, of course, was very, very short indeed. Why? Why this man of integrity and bravery, why is she being told have nothing more to do with them? And of course, she ignores him. And I won't tell you why, because that's towards the end of the book when you find that out. Well, it's a plot, but it's also about people and a place as well.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating, Jackie. And while I had heard rumors about King Edward and, who later became the Duke of Windsor, I had heard rumors of him as a Nazi sympathizer. I certainly hadn't heard about the German plot to restore the Duke to the throne. And of course, that's, where Lady Deanna Claverton's role as a spy becomes so important. As you say, they were looking for somewhere for him to land back in Britain. And as you say, she was a spy, and because of her status, she was able to infiltrate these gatherings to collect information under the guise of cooperation and mutual understanding. So I guess I wanted to ask you, to that end, was Lady Deanna Claverton based on a real historical figure?
If I say yes, will you please promise not to ask me who?
Sure.
Yes, she was based on, actually, she was based on several historical figures. They realised that women could infiltrate far better than men because they'd actually be talking to the wives while the men had their port and cigars, etc., etc. No one really expected a woman to do anything of any importance. And of course, where you've got a young, very attractive woman, men sometimes have loose tongues and try to impress them. So she was one of many women. I actually do know, or I'm pretty sure, I don't have conclusive proof, but I'm pretty sure I know the house and the people where he was going to go once he had been taken ashore. And if you notice in the book, or in fact, I hope no one notices in the book, it's very, very vague about where her home Eagle's Nest is, because I don't want to implicate that family. The younger generation were definitely not fascists. The host involved afterwards was arrested and was imprisoned. And again, I won't give you details about what happened to him because that might also give away who he was. And his family really does not need to be pointed at now as having their father involved in that plot.
Indeed. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, an interesting answer to a question that was raised in my mind about Lady D. She was a complex and utterly riveting character on so many levels. She was, as we've mentioned, part of the aristocracy, but she was incredibly self-sufficient and strong, very used to getting her hands dirty. She was an environmentalist and she bemoaned what I refer to as the voraciousness of war that destroyed the forests and the habitats of so many animals. And it kind of occurred to me that she's a lot like you in that respect.
Yes, but definitely not based on me. Again, that was actually a very aristocratic belief back then. This incredible care of the land. Some, of course, didn't care about the land at all, but a great number cared desperately about the land. They kept large areas of wildland, particularly so that endangered creatures like golden eagles could survive. So the other thing we don't realise too is that after World War One, when death duties came in, when taxes came in, etc., a lot of aristocracy were very, very broke indeed. In this case, she has enough money to support herself because her grandfather has been slowly replacing the family jewels with fakes, completely illegal. But so she actually does have money, even though she has to keep that quite discreet. He has also set up a place for her that will be self-sufficient. But so did a lot of aristocrats and well-off people. If you had an estate, usually there was something called the home farm. And the home farm produced all of the fruit and the vegetables and the milk and the cream and venison and pheasants and all sorts of wonderful things, hothouse asparagus, strawberries, etc., oranges and lemons in hothouses in the winter. So a lot of these places were, in fact, relatively self-sufficient, not for fear of war, but just because that's a way of getting really, really good fresh food that's grown on the estate. And they would be very proud of the fact that a wonderful banquet, most of what was there, from the turkeys, the geese, the pheasants, the whole roast, suckling pig, etc., all of it would have come from, or most of it would have come from the estate. So it'd be absolutely top quality food. So Lady Diana wasn't unusual in that sense. There would have been a lot of, well, there were a lot of estates like that and a lot of people like that as well, including in Australia where we had rationing. People were encouraged to be as self-sufficient. There was a lovely phrase used in both England and Australia. Oh, next week we're going to kill a quarter of a pig. Killing a quarter of a pig meant you were a member of a pig cooperative, and these were legal. You would take a piglet and you would have a share in the piglet. So when the piglet was large enough to slaughter, you would actually get your quarter share of the pig. Well, I think it's a lovely, lovely phrase. But there are so many wonderful anecdotes too. I wished I could have put at least another 50 or 60 into it. One of my favourites is of women pilots were allowed to drive the aircraft from where they'd been manufactured to the aerodrome. They were not allowed weapons, they were completely unarmed. So this female pilot took off and the entire undercarriage of the aircraft fell off. And the sensible thing for her to do then would be to try and get as much altitude as she could and parachute down. She didn't, because in the early part of the war, their uniform were very narrow skirts, and the parachute cord went under her legs. And she knew if she parachuted, everyone would see her knickers and her suspender belt and her stockings, which only went above the knee in the war, and she was too embarrassed. So purely because she was so embarrassed, she actually made this miraculous landing, hardly damaging the plane at all. She was given a medal, she was acclaimed for it, and she said ever since the war, she has been so embarrassed by this medal because she said, I only did it so no one would see my knickers. The other lovely one was the Christmas football match at one of the aerodromes. and they couldn't decide on what code they would play. The Americans wanted gridiron, the Australian wanted either rugby union or Australian rules. I don't know enough about football to know the number of codes that they wanted to play. Anyway, they decided that everyone would play according to their own code. I think 3 or 4 people were hospitalised. Many had black eyes. No one could quite decide who had won, but they voted as a jolly good show and were worth doing.
Now, Jackie, and a really important of Lady D's life was, I would say it was her responsibility, or the responsibility that her position required of her. She was important to the life of the village of Claverton, someone whom the villagers could lean on for support, whether it was supplementing the food supplies of the villagers from her own garden, attending and officiating at important events, and even taking in the 3 orphans who were evacuated from ravaged London. Now, I know it's a term that seems to have fallen out of favour, but I believe then it was part of this concept of noblesse oblige, the idea of privilege entailing responsibility, but it wasn't something that she was always comfortable with.
I think she was very comfortable by being part of the community. I think she wasn't comfortable with actually being Lady D. When the book opens, she's actually extraordinarily lonely. She's had to leave her true friends behind because she has to pretend to be a fascist sympathiser, but also in the village. She will forever be Lady D. No young man is going to come knocking on the door and saying, "Do you want to come to the local dance?" etc. The social divide means she is incredibly isolated during the war. So she wasn't comfortable with that. And I think she was also not comfortable with her main role was actually as a figurehead. The Mrs. Goodwood, the vicar's wife in the book, who is slightly a figure of fun, but only slightly, because as Lady D said, that the Lady Dianas of the world are important as figureheads, but it's the Mrs. Goodwins who actually organise everything behind the scene and get things done. Yes, that would have been one of the reasons why she would have accepted the role of a spy, uncomfortable as it was to report on her own kind, the friends of friends.
You also start each chapter of this book with a recipe, a wartime joke, a song, a poem, an anecdote, or even a line of wartime propaganda. But I was especially intrigued by the recipes that you've included, and many of them were created because of rations or the inability to get certain ingredients. But they really set the tone for the story and the darkest years of the war. And it kind of offered us a glimpse of the resourcefulness of women during wartime. Some even belonged to Lady D herself. Why did you want to include these in the book? And was that an idea that was there from the start, or did you include them later on?
Oh, yes, their grandma, definitely grandma. I was born after the war, well, in fact, quite a long time after the war. But grandma had a cookbook which I wish I could show it to you, but it'd take me 5 minutes to get it out of the cupboard, and it's very, very precious non-acid paper. But great grandma started a cookbook for grandma, as parents often did, or mothers often did. It's probably got the first written recipe for Anzacs, written in 1916 in it. And my word, they make good Anzacs. The secret is let the mixture rest for half an hour before you cook it. But look, my mother was not a cook. That is rather an understatement. My brother and I remember one of her meringues, which when we each held it, we could stretch it the entire length of the kitchen. Grandma taught me how to cook. She was a wonderful cook, but also during the war, she wrote down all of these wonderful wartime recipes. Some of them had been given, like prune tapioca by my great aunt Em. Some of them were just cut out in letters from friends, some cut out from magazines. And so that is a treasured part of that cookbook. Grandma stopped putting recipes into it, I think, round about 1980. So if you want to see a history of Australian and British eating from about 1916 to 1980, I've got Grandma's cookbook. Most of the recipes come from that. When I think of World War II, the first thing I think of is all of Grandma's stories. I grew up in a family of storytellers, and Grandma's stories of how they did survive the war, how you did reuse tea leaves, all sorts of other things like that. They were so absolutely incredibly precious to me and fascinating as a child as well. So, yes, for me, you say World War II. And my immediate thought is food, grandma's recipes. I do think about other things too, as yes, as the book shows. But no, it had to be recipes of the time. And as you say, just the recipe alone shows the hardness of life. We couldn't do it today. Back then, it took about a day a week just to line up to get your rations. It was extraordinary hardship, but also incredible ingenuity, but also absolutely appalling recipes. I mean, just absolutely, truly disgusting recipes, which unfortunately, because rationing continued in England anyway, or Britain anyway, for a long time after the war, and it really destroyed English cooking. Even I think in the last stuffed shoulder of lamb that Grandma served me, the peas were covered with the paper that the butter had been wrapped in. World War II had been long, long over, but you did not waste even that little bit of butter that was on the paper. So peas were always served covered with the butter paper.
So fascinating. And I particularly liked the instructions on how to ice a cake in Britain in 1945. Not only resourceful, but incredibly reusable.
Exactly. I thoroughly recommend it to all brides and bridegrooms now. Forget about the icing. Have it made of cardboard or plaster of Paris or something else, and then lift it off the cake. The cake is easy to serve. No one eats the icing anyway, and you've got this memorial which will last forever of your cake. You can pass it down generation after generation. This was Grandma's wedding cake. Look, it's just so imaginative. Food was pretty boring. There was a lot of emphasis on root vegetables, which is about all Britain grows during winter. Mangelwurzels and turnips, etc., etc., etc. It was boring food, and it looked boring. And they had these wonderful imaginative ways of actually making it look appetizing. And yeah, just the brilliance of covering a cake with a cardboard cover. So it looked as though it was beautifully iced with all of this unavailable sugar. It would have done wonders for morale. Look, I have to say, with some of the recipes, some of them I still use. I can't remember if I did put them in the book because I kept on chopping and changing the recipes to try and fit the plot. But Grandma's apple cake, which is made with almost no butter at all, but no sugar at all. It's made with apple juice, but an enormous amount of grated apple. So it didn't need eggs, it didn't need sugar. It needed almost nothing except flour and grated apple. You could use eggs if you had them. Just incredibly adaptable food. And again, a lot of things like, oh, Grandma's Christmas pudding, which the family still makes Grandma's Christmas pudding. And it's sweetened and made lighter with grated carrot. 3 grated carrots and 1 grated apple is added to the mix, and it makes it wonderfully moist and dark. Because when carrot and apple caramelize, they're absolutely delicious. And Grandma's Christmas pudding is the best I've ever tasted in my life. I have to admit, the whiskey and the rum do help. But so does the caramelized apple and carrot.
Oh, I absolutely love that. Yes, it really did strike me, not only the frugality, I guess, of cooking without a lot of ingredients that, nobody could get, but also the resourcefulness in terms of making up recipes to use ingredients that they did have. I really found that so fascinating. Yeah, so everybody needs to go and have a look at those recipes in the book.
I was very, very careful to choose recipes that just by reading them, you'll know which ones might be delicious and which ones do not try and make this. This is truly absolutely disgusting. Almost any of the ones that are labeled Ministry of Food do not eat. This is not food except for the chooks.
Now, Jackie, I kind of wanted to go back and talk a little bit about the Battle of Dunkirk for a moment. And I think what you've alluded to in this story is that this was one of the pivotal moments in the war, which could also point to a potential inference of an alliance between Hitler and Britain. Now, I don't pretend to understand the intricacies of various battlegrounds of World War II, but did you uncover any research to suggest that Hitler's halt order, when there were hundreds of thousands of British soldiers trapped on the beach at Dunkirk, was part of this strategy?
Yes. In fact, Look, that's not my theory. It's been theorized by many people, and it was actually also the Duke did talk about it in interviews in America. He really didn't know how to keep his mouth shut. So yes, Hitler didn't completely wipe out the British forces, but even more than that, he should have kept on going. After Dunkirk, he should have invaded Britain. It was the logical thing to do. If he had invaded Britain then, he would have won. I think Hitler genuinely wanted an alliance with Britain. Unlike the Kaiser in World War One, who absolutely hated Britain, etc. Hitler believed, again because of the number of fascists, that Germany and England should be close, they should have an alliance, they should have a treaty. He actually wanted to spare England if he could. The Blitz was really softening them up so they would agree to what a lot of people thought would be very sensible, and that would be a treaty. We wouldn't be on Hitler's side, but would be neutral instead. And there was a lot of sympathy for that. So it's very hard to think of any reason why Hitler completely abandoned all his usual tactics and did not follow his triumph at Dunkirk by invading England. And look, we can guess what would have happened then. If Britain had fallen, of course, Australia would have too. Canada probably would not have, or not for a while. They would have battled. And of course, we would have battled. But again, probably lost, particularly as that stage, most of our pilots, our aircraft, and various other things had been sent to Britain and weren't here in Australia, as we found out when Japan entered the war and we were under immediate threat. So yes, there's quite a lot of. I'm not sure if there's any direct proof. I don't think there is any place where Hitler actually said, "I did not conquer Britain then," because of the Duke of Windsor or something like that. But yes, it's been long theorized that there could be no other conceivable reason that whether it was with the Duke of Windsor or not, at that stage, he legitimately believed he could have a treaty with Britain and that there was a chance of having a treaty with Britain. And that is what he wanted.
Scary to contemplate.
Oh, well, it's one of the scarier things to contemplate is in the book as well. And that is how little we knew and how much of the war news was fake. For example, every time Movietone News or the newspapers talked about bombing damage, they made it slightly incorrect. It was part of a plan so that the Germans would think, oh, we're not quite aligned. We need to change where we're going. Probably one of the reasons Parliament House was never bombed was because they were being fed fake information. But one of my favourite ones was stopping the Germans from knowing where the invasion of Europe, the liberation of Europe would come from. And so for the entire year before, they tried to very delicately give the idea that it was going to be in Scotland, which in fact would have been a very sensible place for it to happen. So in every Movietone news, which involved the Queen or the Princess Elizabeth or Margaret, there was always just some little thing in the background that made it look as though it was in Scotland, that there were great troop build-ups. One of my favourite ones was when she was going to visit a hospital. Now, for that entire year, nearly all of the hospitals and the munitions factories that she went to shake hands with the workers or pat the brow of the people in hospital, they were fake. It was a group of intelligence actors, and they'd arrive and, oh, what am I? Oh, yeah, look, today you're broke with a broken leg, and the next day, oh no, look, you'll be in a pity with your hair tied up and you're working in a munitions factory. But they were complete and utter fakes, and she always played it incredibly straight. She would pretend that everyone really did have a broken leg or was in hospital and talk about their bravery, etc., etc. But the favourite bit is a glimpse, just a glimpse of her driving up to the Grand House, which of course was in Scotland, that had been turned into a hospital. The only reason to do that, of course, would have been if that's where D-Day was going to start. And in the background, there is all of this incredible panorama of tanks and armoured vehicles. But in fact, they were just balloons and they were tethered to the ground. And just as she was passing with the cameras on it, one of the armored tanks got loose and started to float above the castle with a bit like a Keystone Cops, everyone frantically racing after it, trying to pull it to the ground because it would have given the entire scheme away. Another wonderful anecdote. Sorry, I'm so full of all of these gorgeous anecdotes. Another one is where they were taking a German spy deliberately through a fake D-Day landing, what have you. But unfortunately, he fell asleep and they couldn't wake him until afterwards. So they'd wasted the entire effort. But they did wonderful things. They painted aerodromes in southern England and the areas which were being bombed. They painted them green to look like grass. But of course, grass changes colour during the year. So they'd repaint it and repaint it so it looked like grass. They cut out wooden cattle and they painted the cattle and the sheep. So anyone flying over would look down and see a field full of sheep. They would hide the aerodrome buildings under haystacks. And so you would actually just part the hay a little bit till you found the doorknob, open the door, and then just slide in to the room, which was covered by haystacks. So no one flying over would have any idea that this actually was an aerodrome.
Such marvelous stories, Jackie. I just love all of that. So interesting as well. Like Lady Deanna, you're passionate about the environment and the horrific effects and consequences of war on the planet. Now, Lady D at one point says bombs could lead to peace. They just had to be big enough, large enough perhaps one day as wars grew bigger to finally destroy the world so the cockroaches and microbes who might be left would have serenity. It's a bleak view.
Lady Diana's views are not my views. No one wins a war. Absolutely no one wins a war. The results after the war are often as horrific for the so-called winner as for the loser. I would really advocate anti-conflict studies to be taught in schools and taught in universities, and some places they are starting to be that. The problem is once you get into a war, there's tangles, there's revenge, there's the emotion. It's like you are tangled up in ropes or an octopus, and there is no way you can get free except by cutting through with something like a very, very large bomb. But one of the important reasons, I think, for everyone studying history is to realize at what point could war not have been inevitable? And when you look at the history of World War I, you look at the history of World War II, in fact, you look at the history of any conflict, you can actually see, okay, here, if only someone did that here. We spend so much of our country's income, our resources, our planning, etc., assuming that the most effective way to safety is by going bang. And I don't believe it is. One of the tragedies, perhaps, is that while we study war, we don't study the number of times we might have been in a war, but it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen then? So studying when wars didn't happen, I think, is even more vital than studying war itself.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think books like yours can help us understand history and war and how we came to be enmeshed in such devastating conflict. But sadly, war continues to happen. You know, the sacrificing of civilian populations for political gain, the continued destruction of the environment for land grabs and annexation. I mean, what is the solution, Jackie?
I don't think there is one solution. I think there are many solutions. One solution is actually a very simple one. It's actually having a counsellor in every school. In Britain, I think it was about 15 years ago, they did a 6-year study on violent terrorists to try and find out what it was that actually radicalized people so that they became violent. And they found, interestingly, there was no correlation between religion, profession, background, perceived injustice in the family. But there was 100% correlation between severe depression as an adolescent. Get rid of that depression and you stop the people who take machine guns into department stores or invade schools, etc. It really is a mental illness. And we need to treat that as a mental illness. Again, put it in the syllabus. Get kids to actually look at how and when could this war have been stopped. When you basically, I think it is when you fire a shot, you have already lost the war. I think the best advice that I've ever got was from a 14-year-old boy. He was from a school for kids with intellectual handicaps. He'd read my book, Hitler's Daughter. It was the first book he had ever read. He had told his teacher that he wanted to write a letter. He'd never written a letter before. And it was just, Dear Jackie French, what I have learned from your book is to be very wary of anyone who tries to make you angry. Love, Jonathan. And he's got it. He's absolutely got it. How did Hitler manage to convince so many people that 44 million people should be killed, that they should live the horrendous life that the Germany and Europe went through? How on earth did he do it? And if you look at the film clips, here is this little angry man yelling and yelling and screaming in anger, and hatred is contagious. He managed to spread anger and hatred through those crowds, and it spread and it spread and it spread. And that, I think, is, again, one of the great things that kids need to be taught very early. And possibly with the election coming up too. It's not a bad lesson for us. Be very wary of anyone who tries to make you angry, because when you're angry, you're not thinking. If someone makes you angry, they are taking control. You are no longer thinking, you're just enjoying the hysteria or semi-hysteria of being angry. Never, ever join the companionship of hate.
I want to direct listeners again to your website, which is a treasure trove of information about your life, your interests, your books, the books that you've written. And it also has a section for writers, and interestingly, a section in which you take on writers to mentor. I wondered if you could tell me a bit about that.
That's an accident. I'm a adjunct professor of the University of Queensland. And in that role, they asked me if I would mentor 2 postgrad students every year. And I said yes. And to my absolute shock, I absolutely love it. It's wonderful. So many people have got brilliant ideas, but they actually don't know how to write. They don't know the structure. In every case I have had so far, it's only taken us 2 or 3 sessions, and in several cases, only 1 session for them to actually realize what they're doing wrong and produce something which is publishable. And look, basically anyone who longs to write a book, who's actually going to spend all of that time writing, have the talent to do it. But you do need the experience and you do need the skills. And when you work one-on-one, yes, look, I've been giving lectures on writing for decades, but realizing the power of the one-on-one to actually say, okay, let's just start at this first paragraph. Now, okay, you've said this 3 times already, this word. So when in doubt, cut it out. You only need, look, that's a wonderful image. But if you put too many in, you're going to clog it up. This is really exciting. People want to know what's going to happen, but don't lose your image. Open another document over there, stick the image in it, and we can use it somewhere else. But don't use it here because it's exciting. And you need to use short sentences and really make people feel as though you're in a hurry, you're escaping. This is dramatic. It is not the time for poetic musing. But don't lose the poetic musing, putting it somewhere else. And again, I realize I just really enjoy it. But one of the other ones too, as I said, look, I am disabled now. I can only sit or stand for a limited amount of time. I did do a lot of traveling around giving workshops, and I still give them by Zoom. But I've realized too, I just really enjoy mentoring. I have to do it by Zoom or by the phone, but it doesn't matter. I suppose editors have discovered this long ago, the complete joy of getting a piece of work which does not work, but knowing that with a few small stylistic changes, suddenly this is something that really grips people. It zaps along, and just seeing the shock, the enthusiasm, the complete joy as people go off and rewrite it, in most cases so far, then get published. So it's just that magic of a few things. Look, creative writing is taught in schools, but you've got me onto one of the other hobby horses. In schools, you've got a sports mistress or master, and they are qualified. Most schools spend a lot more on the oval than they do on the library. They spend more days in intensive sport and sports carnivals than they do on literacy. They assume that the sports teacher has to be qualified, but they don't have anyone who is qualified in remedial literacy for kids who are having problems. The role of teacher librarian, which is vital, people who have got the skill to match the kid with exactly the book that's going to turn them into a reader. It's almost becoming an endangered profession, as sports teachers aren't. We're keeping the sports teachers, but we're getting rid of the teacher librarians. So it means that writing is being taught by people who don't know how to do it, very simply. I have learnt how to teach it, not by doing it myself, because I more or less do it subconsciously, but by working with editors. I have had the extraordinary privilege of working with the most magnificent editors, and they taught me. So I've now had many decades of being taught by these incredibly experienced, insightful people the techniques to actually make a manuscript better. And so it works. And it is absolutely amazing. I'm just thinking of one book. It's one of the joys, too, of working with one publishing house, because they do know that I won't have a hissy fit if they tell me that something doesn't work. They asked me to take out the sex scenes. And I said, why? And they said, they're too good. They unbalance the book, that you have got a story there and you've got characters and you've got a theme, and you don't want to distract your readers. Now, look, I do have books with sex scenes, but this book, they were absolutely right. I'd had a nickel about it. I knew there was something wrong, but I couldn't work out what it was. And that too is why I enjoy being a mentor. Often it is something that is very obvious to any experienced editor. Just do this and the book will balance again. But yes, mostly as I said, to my enormous surprise, I absolutely love doing it. The magic of transforming someone's manuscript, or even people who think they can't write but desperately want to write something. And the technique there is to say, okay, tell me what you want to write about. And what they don't realize is, as they're talking, I'm very quickly taking it down in my own version of shorthand. And when they finish telling me what they want to write about, I then read out what they've told me, and they blink and they suddenly realize they've written it just by simply telling me. That's what you do when you want to explain something, or an incident, or even what happened last weekend, or when you were kidnapped, or all sorts of other things. Telling it to another person, even one other person, is exactly what you do when you're telling it to a readership. And that too is just great fun with these people who assume they can't write, they can't tell a story. And you suddenly start reading out exactly what they have said, but not written. Okay, here it is. You may have to translate my writing in a few places, because my writing is completely illegible. I will, if you like, I will write out a legible copy of what I have written. But this, I did not. All I did was act as your secretary and your assistant. You did it. Seeing the shock on people's faces. They've never been taught to write. And they don't realize, in fact, that if you can tell someone a story, if you can convince someone, if you're capable of a good argument, or even telling your best friend tactfully why they shouldn't have their hair done like that, you're capable of doing it in print too. You're a good communicator. You're a wonderful persuader. You just need the confidence. And particularly with people from deprived backgrounds where there hasn't been a strong literacy background, that is a wonderful technique, because they suddenly realize how well they can communicate, how strong their words are, how incredibly powerful their ideas are. This is something you did. And their whole image of themselves changes, and they realize what they can do and what is possible. So that's why I've started mentoring.
I absolutely love that, Jackie. I can't for the life of me understand how you would have time to do what you are doing. But if anyone is interested, you can contact Jackie via her website.
Ironically, it is because I'm disabled that I now have got more time to mentor. I was spending a heck of a lot of time sitting in airports, and now I no longer spend a lot of time sitting in airports. And so, yes, so there is now time to mentor.
Jackie, I've so enjoyed chatting with you once more about this brilliant book. History lovers out there will absolutely devour The Whisperer's War. It's been an honour and a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, look, it's been so much fun. Thank you. A real pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.